It was a cold, silent evening when I pushed open the heavy wooden door to the restaurant's private room. Laughter and chatter poured out, hitting me like a wave of nostalgia mixed with unease. I paused, gripping the edge of the door. This wasn't just another class reunion, it was the first time I would face Benjamin in 10 years. The room was filled with familiar faces, now older but still carrying the echoes of our youth. They were laughing, toasting, and fawning over someone. I knew who it was before I even laid eyes on him. "Benjamin, you've really done well for yourself, haven't you?" someone teased, their voice dripping with envy. "Not only are you killing it in the big city, but you also married the class beauty." Of course, another chimed in. "Just look at him, Mr. Song, the big boss. Unlike us common folks." Benjamin's voice floated through the air, calm and confident. "Well, hard work pays off." I stepped further into the room, unnoticed at first. My heart pounded, but I kept my expression neutral. It wasn't like I hadn't prepared for this moment. I had replayed this scene in my mind countless times, imagining what I would say, how I would act. But now that I was here, face to face with my past, all those rehearsals seemed useless. A sudden hush fell over the room as someone finally noticed me. "Well, speak of the devil," the class monitor exclaimed, grinning. "Isabella. Look who's here." All eyes turned toward me. Benjamin's gaze followed, and for the first time in a decade, our eyes met. He sat on the plush leather sofa, a cigar in one hand and his other arm draped around Emma, the class beauty. She leaned into him, her diamond-studded earrings catching the light. The perfect couple. Benjamin's eyes swept over me, his expression unreadable at first. Then, slowly, his lips curled into a smirk. "Is this what you've become after 10 years?" he said, his tone dripping with mockery. I stood tall, even though I knew I looked plain compared to Emma. My simple dress and lack of makeup didn't scream wealth or success, but I didn't care. "Long time no see," I said evenly, ignoring his jab. Emma smiled faintly, her eyes scanning me from head to toe, clearly unimpressed. "It's been ages, Isabella. You look different." I didn't bother with a response. Instead, I turned and joined a group of familiar classmates who greeted me warmly. The conversation shifted away from me, back to Benjamin and his grand achievements. Toasts were raised, and glasses clinked. Everyone was eager to bask in his success, to align themselves with the rising star. As the evening wore on, I found myself slipping away from the table. I needed a moment to breathe. The bathroom was a welcome escape from the noise and tension. But as I exited, I almost collided with Benjamin in the hallway. He leaned against the wall, his face flushed from the alcohol. His smirk returned, sharper this time. "Isabella," he drawled. "Is this what you've done with your life in the 10 years since you left me?" I stared at him, unblinking. His words didn't sting the way he intended. Instead, they brought back memories of a different time, a different life. I didn't respond, and Benjamin's smirk faltered. For the first time, he seemed uneasy. "You know," he said, stepping closer, "you could have had all of this. The success, the money, the life. But you chose to stay in that small town, stuck in the past." Before I could reply, a deep, familiar voice interrupted us. "Isabella, I've been looking for you." We both turned to see Christopher, walking toward us with calm confidence. He smiled warmly at me before turning to Benjamin, his expression cool. "Sorry, my wife is pregnant. I'd appreciate it if we kept the smoking indoors to a minimum." The color drained from Benjamin's face. His cigar hovered in midair as he stared at Christopher, then back at me. Panic flickered in his eyes, just for a moment. "I'll see you inside," I told Christopher softly, brushing past Benjamin without a second glance. For the first time that evening, Benjamin looked truly unsettled. He wasn't used to losing control of a situation, but tonight, everything was slipping out of his grasp. I returned to the dining room, but my mind was far from the laughter and chatter around me. Christopher's sudden entrance had tilted the balance, leaving Benjamin visibly shaken. Yet, even as I sat back at the table, I could feel Benjamin's gaze burning into me, full of questions he would never dare ask in front of everyone. The class monitor tried to lighten the mood. "All right, let's keep the drinks flowing. We're all here to have fun, not brood over old grudges." Christopher sat down beside me, his hand casually resting on my chair. He was the picture of ease, but I knew him well enough to sense the subtle tension in his posture. "You okay?" he asked under his breath. I nodded. "It's just odd seeing everyone again." He smiled knowingly and leaned in closer. "I'm here. Don't let him bother you." Across the table, Benjamin was trying hard to maintain his composure. Emma, oblivious to the shift in dynamics, was chattering away about their upcoming vacation plans. "We're thinking about Europe this year," she said, her tone pointed as she glanced in my direction. "Benjamin loves Paris, don't you, darling?" Benjamin mumbled, distracted. His eyes were still fixed on me and Christopher. Emma frowned, clearly annoyed at being ignored, and leaned in closer to Benjamin. She whispered something in his ear, but he barely reacted. I could see her frustration mounting as she glanced at me again. This wasn't how she'd planned for the evening to go. The class monitor interrupted the awkwardness with a loud clap. "Christopher, you're late to the party, but we've heard so much about you. Isabella's lucky to have you." Christopher smiled graciously. "Thank you. I'm lucky to have her." Benjamin's knuckles whitened around his glass. I excused myself from the table again, this time to escape the oppressive atmosphere. As I stepped into the cool night air outside, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The reunion was supposed to be a brief distraction, not a battleground for old and new emotions. "Running away already?" A voice behind me made me freeze. I turned to see Benjamin stepping out into the courtyard, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I needed fresh air," I said simply, trying to walk past him, but he moved to block my path. "You've changed," he said, his tone softer now, almost wistful. "You're not the Isabella the first remember." I raised an eyebrow. "The Isabella you remember is long gone." His eyes searched mine, as if looking for a trace of the past. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked suddenly. "Tell you what?" "That you married Christopher." His voice was tight, almost accusing. I let out a short laugh. "And why would I? We've been strangers for 10 years. What I do with my life is none of your business, Benjamin." "You're right," he admitted, though his tone suggested he didn't fully believe it. "But I can't help wondering what?" I cut him off, my patience wearing thin. He hesitated, then finally said, "If you're really happy." The question caught me off guard. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he asked, as if the answer mattered more to him than he cared to admit. For a moment, I saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, the Benjamin I once knew. "I am," I said firmly, holding his gaze. "Happier than I ever was with you." My words seemed to hit him like a punch. He stepped back slightly, his confidence wavering. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said quietly. "Didn't you?" I replied, my voice steady but sharp. "You made your choices, Benjamin. You followed Emma to a new city, built your life, and left everything else behind. Don't act like you didn't know what you were doing." He opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of the door opening behind us cut him off. Christopher stepped out, his presence commanding as always. "Everything okay out here?" he asked, his eyes darting between Benjamin and me. "Just catching up," I said, brushing past Benjamin to stand beside Christopher. "We're done." Benjamin's jaw tightened, but he didn't say another word as Christopher and I walked back inside together. For the rest of the evening, Benjamin avoided me, but I could feel the weight of his gaze every time I glanced his way. When the reunion finally ended, Christopher and I were the last to leave. He helped me into the car, his hand resting protectively on my back. "You sure you're all right?" he asked as we drove away. "I'm fine," I said, though my thoughts were anything but. Seeing Benjamin again had stirred up memories I'd buried long ago, memories of a different life, a different version of myself. But as I looked at Christopher, his steady presence beside me, I reminded myself that those memories were just that, memories. The life I had now was real, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. Still, as the car sped through the quiet streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that Benjamin wasn't finished. Something about the way he looked at me tonight made it clear, this wasn't the last I'd see of him. The days following the reunion passed uneventfully, yet I couldn't shake the lingering unease. Benjamin's gaze, his words, and even Emma's confrontational attitude all played on a loop in my mind. Christopher noticed my quietness, but he didn't press. He always knew when to give me space. It wasn't until the following weekend, as we sat in the living room planning a few renovations, that my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. The name flashed like an unwelcome ghost, Benjamin. Christopher noticed. "Who is it?" "No one important," I replied, silencing the phone. But the unease in my chest tightened. Benjamin hadn't reached out in years, and now, twice in 1 week? This couldn't just be coincidence. Christopher raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask further. I appreciated his trust, though I hated the idea of anything from my past disrupting the peace we'd built. The phone buzzed again moments later, this time with a text. "Isabella, we need to talk. Meet me at Iceland Cafe tomorrow at noon." I stared at the message, debating whether to reply. My instinct told me to ignore it, to delete it and move on. But another part of me, a smaller, quieter voice, was curious. What could Benjamin possibly want now? Christopher glanced over. "Something wrong?" "No," I said quickly, locking the phone. "Just spam." He gave me a skeptical look, but didn't push further. I didn't know why I lied, but part of me didn't want him worrying over something that might be meaningless. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I found myself standing outside Iceland Cafe, its familiar sign swaying gently in the winter breeze. I hadn't been here in years, yet it still looked the same, quaint and cozy, with the smell of fresh coffee wafting out whenever the door opened. I walked in, and there he was. Benjamin sat at a corner table, his posture as confident as ever. But there was something different about him now. His usual arrogance seemed muted, replaced by a restless energy. His eyes lit up when he saw me, though he quickly masked it with a more reserved expression. "Isabella," he greeted, standing as I approached. "Thanks for coming." I sat down across from him, keeping my distance. "You said you wanted to talk, so talk." Benjamin hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "I've been thinking a lot since the reunion. About us, about everything that happened." "There's nothing to think about," I said bluntly. "We both made our choices. That's all there is to it." "Is it?" he countered, leaning forward. "Because I don't think it's that simple." "It is that simple," I said, my tone sharp. "You chose Emma, Benjamin. You built your life in another city, and I stayed here. There's nothing left to discuss." He let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't come here to argue with you. I need you to understand something." I crossed my arms, waiting. "Back then," he began, his voice softer now, "when we had that fight. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I thought I was doing what was best for both of us." I scoffed. "Best for us? Or best for you?" Benjamin flinched at my words, but didn't deny them. "Maybe I was selfish," he admitted. "But at the time, I thought staying in the city was the only way to secure our future. I didn't realize how much I was asking of you." "It wasn't just about the city, Benjamin," I said, my voice steady. "It was about you breaking your promises. You said we'd come back once we built our careers. You said we'd start a family here, near my parents. But when the time came, you changed your mind." He looked down, his fingers tapping the edge of the table. "I know I messed up." "Messed up?" I repeated, anger bubbling to the surface. "You didn't just mess up, Benjamin. You left me. And then, in this life, you didn't hesitate to do it all over again. He looked up, his expression pained. I thought you'd wait for me. The words hung in the air, heavy and absurd. I stared at him, incredulous. Wait for you? After you left me to chase after Emma? Are you hearing yourself? I thought you'd understand, he said quietly. That you'd see I needed to figure things out on my own. I thought you'd still what? I cut him off. Still love you? Still pine after you while you played house with Emma? You really think that little of me? Benjamin's face twisted, as if my words physically hurt him. That's not what I meant. It doesn't matter what you meant, I said firmly, standing up. What matters is what you did. And I don't owe you anything, Benjamin. Not my time, not my attention, and definitely not my forgiveness. He stood too, blocking my path. Isabella, please. Just hear me out. I glared at him. You have 2 minutes. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. I know I don't deserve it, but I want a second chance. I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I've changed. That we can make it work this time. I laughed bitterly. Do you hear yourself? You have a fiancé, Benjamin. A life. What makes you think I'd ever want to go back to you? Because I know you still love me, he said, his voice cracking slightly. I can see it in your eyes. My laughter died instantly. You don't know anything about me, I said coldly. Not anymore. He reached for my hand, but I pulled away. You're wrong, Benjamin. The only thing I feel for you now is pity. His face fell, and for the first time I saw true defeat in his eyes. Isabella, I've moved on, I said, cutting him off one last time. You should too. Without another word, I walked out of the cafe, leaving him standing there. As the cold air hit my face, I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite place. But one thing was clear, I was done letting Benjamin haunt my life. I thought that walking out of the cafe that day would be the end of it. I hoped Benjamin would finally take the hint and let the past stay buried where it belonged. But deep down, I knew better. Benjamin was never the type to give up so easily, especially when something, or someone, slipped out of his control. For a few days, everything was quiet. I focused on my routine, my work, and the life I'd built with Christopher. But then, it began. Small, seemingly insignificant moments at first. A text message asking if I'd reconsider meeting him. A bouquet of roses delivered to my office with no note, though I knew exactly who they were from. And then, on the third day, the call came. It was late in the evening. Christopher was upstairs reading, and I was finishing up some emails when my phone rang. I glanced at the screen. Benjamin again. I considered ignoring it, but something about the persistence made me answer. What do you want, Benjamin? I said, my voice laced with frustration. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, softly, I just need 5 minutes. You've already had more than enough of my time, I said, flatly. Please, Isabella. Just hear me out, he said, his tone uncharacteristically pleading. After this, if you still want me to leave you alone, I will. I hesitated. Something in his voice felt different. Desperate, almost. Against my better judgment, I sighed. Fine. 5 minutes. Thank you, he said, relief evident in his voice. Can we meet tomorrow? Same place, same time. No, I said firmly. Say what you need to say now. I can't do it over the phone, he replied quickly. It's important. I pinched the bridge of my nose, already regretting picking up the call. This is the last time, Benjamin. I promise, he said, and for once, I thought I detected sincerity in his voice. The next day, I arrived at the cafe earlier than planned, determined to get this over with. I chose a seat near the window, where I could see the street outside. If things went south, I wanted an easy exit. Benjamin arrived a few minutes later, looking more disheveled than I'd ever seen him. His usual sharp suit was replaced by a casual jacket, and there were dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. He sat down across from me, his gaze searching my face. "You've got 5 minutes," I reminded him. He nodded, clasping his hands together on the table. "I know you don't owe me anything, Isabella. And I know I've made mistakes, more than I can count. But I need you to understand why I'm here." "I don't need to understand anything," I interrupted. "You made your choices, Benjamin." "So did I." "That's just it," he said, leaning forward. "I made the wrong choices. I thought I was chasing what I wanted, success, recognition, the life I dreamed of. But I was wrong." "Is this the part where I'm supposed to feel sorry for you?" I asked, crossing my arms. He flinched, but didn't back down. "No. I don't want your pity. I want you to know that I regret leaving you. Not just in this life, but the last one too." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. For years, I had longed to hear him say those words. But now, they felt hollow. Too little, too late. "Benjamin, I don't know what you expect me to say," I said, my voice steady, despite the turmoil inside me. "You can't rewrite the past." "I know," he said quickly. "I'm not asking for that. He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I want to make things right." I shook my head. "You can't." "Why not?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly. "Why can't we try again? We were good together once. We could be again." I stared at him, incredulous. "You're unbelievable. Do you think you can just walk back into my life after 10 years and pick up where we left off? It doesn't work that way, Benjamin." "I know I've hurt you," he said, his voice softer now. "But I can't stop thinking about you, Isabella. Every time I close my eyes, it's you I see. Not Emma. Not anyone else. Just you." I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "This was a mistake," I said, grabbing my bag. "I shouldn't have come." "Wait," he said, reaching for my hand but stopping short. "Please, don't walk away. Not again." I turned to him, my voice cold. "The only one who walked away, Benjamin, was you." And I moved on. I left the cafe without looking back, my heart pounding in my chest. The encounter had stirred emotions I thought I'd buried long ago, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to let Benjamin derail the life I'd built. For days after my second meeting with Benjamin, his words echoed in my mind. "I regret leaving you. I can't stop thinking about you." Words I once would have given anything to hear. But now, they felt like shackles, tugging at a part of my life I'd long since left behind. I didn't tell Christopher about the meeting. I didn't see the point in stirring unnecessary conflict when Benjamin's chapter in my life was firmly closed. Or so I thought. It was a quiet Sunday morning when the next ripple of chaos arrived. Christopher and I were enjoying breakfast on the balcony, the sunlight streaming through the trees. I had just taken a sip of tea when Christopher's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "What is it?" I asked. "It's strange," he said, holding up the screen. It was an email from an unfamiliar address with the subject line, "Benjamin's song, for your eyes only." My stomach dropped. "Don't open it." Christopher raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" "Because it's probably nothing," I said quickly. Too quickly. He gave me a curious look, then clicked on the email anyway. The message was short but pointed. "Does she still love me? You should ask her before it's too late." Christopher's expression darkened as he read the words. He set the phone down slowly and turned to me. "Care to explain?" I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "It's Benjamin," I admitted. "He's been reaching out." Christopher's jaw tightened. "How long has this been going on?" "Since the reunion," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I've told him I'm not interested. I even met him to make it clear." And you didn't think to tell me? His voice was calm, but I could sense the tension beneath the surface. I didn't want to worry you, I said. I thought he'd give up after I shut him down. Christopher stood, pacing the balcony. Isabella, this isn't just some old classmate catching up. He's clearly not over you. I know, I said, standing to face him. But it doesn't matter. I'm over him. He's the past, Christopher. You're my future. He stopped pacing and looked at me, his expression softening slightly. I trust you, he said after a moment. But I don't trust him. I nodded, relieved he wasn't angry with me. I'll handle it. You shouldn't have to, he said firmly. If he contacts you again, I'll deal with him myself. The protectiveness in his voice warmed me, but I also knew that Benjamin wasn't someone who backed down easily. This wasn't over. The following week, I received an invitation to another gathering, this time a smaller, more intimate dinner with a few close classmates. I almost declined, but the class monitor called to personally insist that I come. It's just a casual get-together, she said. No big speeches, no crowds. You and Christopher should join us. I reluctantly agreed, hoping it would be a quiet evening. But as soon as Christopher and I arrived, I realized I'd made a mistake. Benjamin was there. He was seated at the head of the table, his eyes lighting up the moment we walked in. He quickly masked it with a polite smile, but I could feel the intensity of his gaze. Emma wasn't with him, which only added to the awkwardness. Isabella, the class monitor, greeted cheerfully, pulling me into a hug. And Christopher. So glad you both could make it. Christopher nodded politely, but I could see the wariness in his eyes. He spotted Benjamin immediately and kept a protective hand on the small of my back as we found our seats. Dinner was tense. The conversation flowed easily among our classmates, but every so often, I'd catch Benjamin watching me. Christopher noticed too, his jaw tightening each time. Halfway through the meal, Benjamin raised his glass. A toast, he said, his voice commanding attention. To old friends and the memories we've shared. Everyone raised their glasses, murmuring their agreement. Christopher and I followed suit, though neither of us said a word. Benjamin's eyes lingered on me as he added, and to the ones who've left a lasting impact on our lives. My chest tightened, but I kept my face neutral. Christopher, however, set his glass down with a deliberate clink, his expression unreadable. After dinner, as people began to mingle and chat, Benjamin approached us. Christopher, he said smoothly, extending a hand. It's been a while. Christopher shook his hand, his grip firm. It has. Benjamin turned to me, his smile softening. Isabella. You look well. Thank you, I said curtly, taking a step closer to Christopher. Benjamin's gaze flicked between us, and for a moment, I thought he might back off. But then he said, Can we talk? Just for a minute. She has nothing to say to you, Christopher interjected, his tone calm but firm. Benjamin ignored him, focusing on me. Please, Isabella. It's important. I glanced at Christopher, whose jaw was set in stone. It's fine, I said softly, squeezing his hand. I'll be right back. He didn't look happy, but he nodded. 1 minute, he said to Benjamin. Benjamin led me to a quiet corner, away from the others. I didn't mean to cause trouble, he began. Then stop, I said sharply. Stop calling, stop texting, and stop sending cryptic emails to my husband. He looked genuinely surprised. I didn't send, he paused, then sighed. Okay, maybe I did. But it was just one email. I needed him to understand. Understand what? I demanded. That you're stuck in the past? That you can't move on? That's not my problem, Benjamin. His face hardened. Do you really not feel anything for me anymore? No, I said without hesitation. Whatever I felt for you died a long time ago. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment, he looked utterly defeated. I don't know how to let go, he admitted quietly. That's not my responsibility, I said, my voice softening despite myself. You made your choices, Benjamin. It's time for you to live with them. He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with regret. You're right. I wish things had been different. So do I said, turning to walk away. But they're not. The ride home from the dinner was quiet. Christopher's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his gaze fixed on the road. I could feel the tension radiating from him, but I didn't know how to break the silence. Finally, he spoke. Did he say anything important? I hesitated. He apologized. Said he regrets the choices he made. Christopher let out a humorless laugh. Of course, he does. That seems to be his specialty, regret. I turned to him, unsure how to respond. It doesn't matter what he feels. He's the past, Christopher. You're my present. My future. He glanced at me briefly, his expression softening. I know. But it's hard not to feel protective. Protective of what? I asked gently. Of us, he said simply. I don't want him anywhere near you, Isabella. He's trying to drag you back into his mess, and I won't let him. I reached over and placed a hand on his arm. You don't have to worry about that. I've made it clear to him that we're done. Christopher nodded, but the furrow in his brow remained. I knew he trusted me, but Benjamin's persistence was wearing on both of us. The following week was uneventful, at least on the surface. Benjamin hadn't called or texted since the dinner, and I began to hope he'd finally taken the hint. But that hope was short-lived. One evening, as Christopher and I were preparing for bed, there was a knock at the door. Christopher frowned, glancing at the clock. Who could that be at this hour? I'll check, I said, pulling on a robe. When I opened the door, my heart sank. Benjamin stood on the porch, his hair disheveled and his eyes bloodshot. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. What are you doing here? I asked, my voice sharp. I needed to see you, he said, his voice low and urgent. Please, just give me 5 minutes. Benjamin, it's late, I said, stepping out onto the porch and closing the door behind me. You can't keep doing this. I know, he said, running a hand through his hair. I know I'm making things worse, but I can't help it, Isabella. I can't stop thinking about you. I shook my head, exasperated. You need to move on. I have. You think it's that easy? He asked, his voice breaking. To forget everything we had? To forget you? It's not about forgetting, I said firmly. It's about accepting that it's over. He stepped closer, desperation etched into every line of his face. What if I can't accept that? What if I can't let you go? You don't have a choice, I said, my tone unyielding. This isn't about you anymore, Benjamin. It's about me. My life. My happiness. And you're not part of it. The door opened behind me, and Christopher stepped out. He didn't say a word, but his presence was enough to make Benjamin take a step back. This isn't the time or place, Christopher said calmly, though his voice carried an edge. You need to leave. Benjamin looked between us, his face crumpling. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to disrupt your life. You did, Christopher said bluntly. But it stops now. For a moment, Benjamin looked like he might argue, but then he nodded. I'll go. He turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped. As he disappeared into the night, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Christopher turned to me, his expression unreadable. Are you okay? I nodded, though my heart was still racing. I think this is finally the end. I hope so, he said, pulling me into a hug. Because I don't know how much more of him I can take. But it wasn't the end. A few days later, I received a package at work. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small velvet box. The letter was short and to the point. Isabella, I don't expect forgiveness or reconciliation. I only want you to know that I truly regret everything. This ring was meant for you, in this life and the last. Keep it as a reminder of what we had. Or throw it away. The choice is yours. Benjamin, I opened the box to find a stunning diamond ring, far larger than anything I could have imagined. My first instinct was to toss it in the trash, but something stopped me. Not sentimentality, but a sense of closure. This was Benjamin's final gesture, his way of letting go. When I got home that evening, I showed the ring and letter to Christopher. He read it silently, his jaw tightening as he reached the end. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. "Return it," I said without hesitation. Christopher nodded, his expression softening. "Good." The next day, I mailed the ring and letter back to Benjamin with a simple note: "I don't need reminders of the past. Please don't contact me again." It felt like a weight had been lifted. For the first time in years, I truly felt free of Benjamin's shadow. I had chosen my path, and there was no looking back. But as I sealed the package and sent it off, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last I'd hear from him. Weeks passed after I returned Benjamin's ring, and life slowly fell back into its rhythm. I convinced myself that Benjamin had finally understood the boundaries I'd set and that his chapter in my life was truly over. Christopher and I returned to our routines, planning for the baby, spending quiet evenings together, and building the life we'd dreamed of. But peace has a way of being fleeting, especially when it involves someone like Benjamin. It was a bright afternoon when my phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Benjamin, but the class monitor. "Isabella," she said breathlessly, "you need to come to the hospital." My heart sank. "Hospital? What happened?" "It's Benjamin," she said. "He collapsed in his office this morning. Stress, they think. He's asking for you." For a moment, I stood frozen, the phone pressed to my ear. Memories of our past, both in this life and the one before, rushed through me like a tidal wave. Then, Christopher's voice broke through my thoughts. "What is it?" I ended the call and turned to him, my stomach twisting. "Benjamin's in the hospital." Christopher's expression darkened. "And?" "They said he's asking for me," I said hesitantly. He frowned. "Isabella, this isn't your responsibility. He's not your problem anymore." "I know," I said quickly. "But I can't ignore it." Christopher studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "Do what you need to do. But don't let him manipulate you." When I arrived at the hospital, I found Benjamin lying in a stark white room, and 4 drip in his arm. He looked pale and exhausted, a far cry from the confident man I'd seen at the reunion. His eyes lit up when he saw me, but the spark quickly faded into something more subdued. "You came," he said weakly. "I heard you weren't well," I replied, standing near the door. "What happened?" He shrugged, his voice hoarse. "Stress," they said. "Overwork. Not eating properly. The usual." I stayed silent, unsure of what to say. Benjamin looked at me for a long moment, then said, "I didn't think you'd come." "I almost didn't," I admitted. "But you've been asking for me, and I needed to know why." He let out a soft laugh, though it lacked humor. "Because I wanted to see you. One last time." "Benjamin, no, listen," he interrupted, his voice gaining strength. "I know I've been a mess lately. I've been pushing you, showing up uninvited, saying things I shouldn't. I've been selfish, Isabella, and I'm sorry." I blinked, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. He continued, "I needed to see you because I'm leaving." "Leaving?" I echoed. He nodded. "I've decided to go back to the city. To sell my company and start over somewhere new. Far away." I didn't know how to respond. This was the last thing I'd expected to hear from him. "I've been holding on to something that's long gone," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "And in the process, I've hurt you, myself, and everyone around me. It's time for me to let go." I swallowed hard, unsure of what to feel. Relief? Sadness? Gratitude? Maybe all three. That's probably for the best, I said softly. Benjamin nodded, a small, bittersweet smile on his lips. I hope you can forgive me someday. For everything. I met his gaze, and for the first time in years, I saw the Benjamin I used to know, the one I'd loved so deeply in another life. I forgave you a long time ago, I said honestly. But forgiveness doesn't mean we can go back to what we were. I know, he said. And I'm not asking for that anymore. I just want you to be happy. I am, I said firmly. I hope you find happiness too. He closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek. Take care, Isabella. You too, I said, stepping back toward the door. Goodbye, Benjamin. And with that, I walked out of the hospital room, leaving Benjamin behind for what I hoped would be the last time. That night, as I lay in bed beside Christopher, I told him everything. He listened quietly, his hand resting on my stomach, where our child grew. When I finished, he kissed my forehead and said, I'm glad you went. Not for him, for you. It's good to have closure. I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. I think I can finally let it all go now. Christopher pulled me close, his warmth grounding me. He's the past, Isabella. And the future? That's ours. For the next few weeks, life felt lighter, freer. I didn't hear from Benjamin again, and the absence of his presence was a relief. But just when I thought the story was truly over, a package arrived at my door. It was from Benjamin. Inside was a letter and a small notebook. The letter read, Isabella, thank you for coming to see me at the hospital. I'm keeping my promise to leave and start over, but before I go, I wanted to give you this. It's the journal I kept in the previous life. I thought you might want it as a reminder of what we went through, of how far we've come. This is my last goodbye. Take care of yourself and your family. Benjamin. I opened the notebook hesitantly. Inside were pages filled with memories, dates, events, and small details from our shared past. There were even sketches of me, drawn with surprising skill. It was like holding a piece of our old life in my hands. But as I flipped through the pages, I realized something important. Those memories didn't define me anymore. They were part of my story, yes, but they weren't my story. Not anymore. I placed the notebook back in the box and set it aside. I had no intention of revisiting it. My life with Christopher and the family we were building was all I needed. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of Benjamin's departure began to fade like a shadow retreating in the light. His notebook sat unopened in a drawer, tucked away like an old photograph, a piece of the past I no longer needed to examine. Christopher and I focused on the future. The baby's arrival was drawing closer, and we threw ourselves into preparations. The nursery slowly came to life with soft pastel colors, a crib that Christopher insisted on assembling himself, and a shelf filled with children's books. Each detail felt like a celebration of the life we were creating together. One evening, as I sat on the couch folding tiny clothes, Christopher brought me a cup of tea and sat down beside me. You seem more at peace, he said, watching me closely. I am, I said, smiling. I think, for the first time in a long time, everything feels right. He reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. That's all I ever wanted for you. I know, I said, squeezing his hand. And I'm grateful every day. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the soft hum of the evening surrounding us. But just as I began to relax, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I glanced at it, my heart skipping a beat when I saw the name on the screen, Class Monitor. Are you going to answer that? Christopher asked. I hesitated. Probably just another get-together invitation, I said, picking up the phone. But when I answered, the urgency in her voice immediately set me on edge. Isabella, she said quickly, I know I shouldn't be calling you about this, but, it's Benjamin. What about him? I asked, my stomach tightening. He's gone, she said softly. The words didn't register at first. Gone? What do you mean? He passed away, she said, her voice breaking. It happened 2 days ago. I thought you should know. My breath caught in my throat. What happened? They said it was an accident, she explained. He was driving late at night, and his car went off the road. The paramedics couldn't save him. I sat there in stunned silence, the phone pressed to my ear. Benjamin was gone. The man who had once been my entire world in another life, the man who had spent years chasing me in this one, was gone. Isabella, the class monitor, prompted gently. Are you still there? I'm here, I managed to say, my voice shaky. Thank you for letting me know. His funeral is tomorrow, she added. If you want to come. I'll think about it, I said quickly, ending the call before she could say more. Christopher was watching me closely, concern etched into his features. What happened? Benjamin, I said, struggling to find the words. He's dead. Christopher's expression softened, and he reached for my hand. Are you okay? I don't know, I admitted, the weight of the news pressing down on me. It's just, so sudden. He nodded, his grip on my hand steady. You don't have to process this alone, you know. I'm here. I know, I said, leaning into him. His presence grounded me, but my mind was still spinning. Benjamin's life had ended so abruptly, and I couldn't help but wonder if he had been at peace in his final moments. The next day, I decided to attend the funeral. Christopher offered to come with me, but I told him I needed to do this alone. He understood, though I could see the worry in his eyes as he kissed me goodbye. The funeral was a somber affair, held at a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of the city. A small group of people had gathered, former classmates, business associates, and a few family members. Emma was there, dressed in black and standing apart from the others. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. As I approached the group, Emma's eyes met mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, to my surprise, she walked over. I didn't expect to see you here, she said, her voice subdued. Neither did I admitted. But I felt. I don't know. Like I needed to. She nodded, her gaze dropping to the ground. He talked about you a lot, you know. Even after everything. You were always in the back of his mind. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I simply said, I hope he found some peace. Emma's lips pressed into a thin line. I think he did, in his own way. But he never stopped blaming himself for losing you. The words hit harder than I expected. I looked at the casket, the finality of it all sinking in. Whatever Benjamin had felt, whatever regrets he'd carried, they were now buried with him. As the service ended, people began to disperse. I lingered by the grave, my thoughts a jumble of emotions I couldn't quite name. Goodbye, Benjamin, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I hope you find what you were looking for. When I returned home, Christopher was waiting for me. He didn't ask any questions, simply wrapping me in a warm hug. And as I stood there in his arms, I felt the weight of Benjamin's story finally lift from my shoulders. It was over. Truly, finally over. For the first time in 2 lifetimes, I felt free to fully embrace the life I had chosen. The life that was mine. After Benjamin's funeral, life felt different, not heavier, but quieter. It was as though the lingering threads of a past life had finally unraveled, leaving behind a blank canvas. I was free, in the truest sense of the word. Yet, his death had left me with an unshakable realization: life was fragile, and time was fleeting. Christopher noticed my introspective mood in the days that followed. You've been quiet, he said one evening as we sat on the couch, his hand resting on my growing belly. I've just been thinking, I admitted. About how much has happened, how far we've come. It's a lot to process. He nodded, his thumb brushing against my hand. Take your time. You don't have to rush through it. His patience was a gift, and I leaned into it. The memories of Benjamin no longer haunted me, but they reminded me of how easily I had once let someone else dictate the course of my life. That wouldn't happen again. As the weeks passed, my focus shifted entirely to the baby. The closer we got to the due date, the more real everything felt. Christopher was a whirlwind of activity, assembling furniture, organizing baby supplies, and reading every parenting book he could get his hands on. His excitement was contagious, and soon, the nursery was a picture-perfect haven, ready to welcome our child. One rainy afternoon, as we sat folding baby clothes, Christopher turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "What do you think about the name Benjamin?" The question caught me off guard. "Benjamin?" I repeated. He nodded. "Not because of him," he said quickly, as if reading my hesitation. "But because it's a strong name." And I thought, maybe it could be a way to honor the past while moving forward. I stared at him, my emotions swirling. The name carried so much weight, so much history. Christopher smiled, leaning over to kiss my forehead. "New meaning. I like that." The day our son was born was a blur of emotion and exhaustion. Christopher was by my side the entire time, his hand never leaving mine. When the doctor finally placed our baby in my arms, tears streamed down my face. He was perfect, tiny, warm, and full of life. "Welcome to the world, little one," I whispered, my heart swelling with a love I'd never known before. Christopher leaned over, his voice soft. "What do you think? Benjamin?" I looked down at our son, his tiny fingers curling around mine. "Benjamin Christopher," I said, the name feeling right in a way I couldn't fully explain. Christopher beamed, and in that moment everything else faded away. The past, the pain, the regrets, they were all gone. All that mattered was the family we had created. The weeks following Benjamin Christopher's birth were filled with sleepless nights and joyful chaos. Our lives revolved around feedings, diaper changes, and the quiet moments when he would fall asleep in my arms. Christopher was an incredible partner, always stepping in to help and making sure I felt supported. One evening, as I rocked our son to sleep, I found myself thinking about Benjamin again, not with sadness, but with gratitude. His mistakes and regrets had taught me invaluable lessons about love, boundaries, and self-worth. In some strange way, he had helped shape the person I had become. "I hope you found peace," I whispered, more to myself than to anyone else. And as Benjamin Christopher stirred in my arms, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't realized I was still seeking. Months later, Christopher and I hosted a small gathering to celebrate our son's arrival. Friends and family filled the house, their laughter and joy creating a warmth that made our home feel alive. As I watched Christopher cradle our son and introduce him to everyone, I felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. One of my classmates from the reunion approached me during the party. "You seem so happy, Isabella," she said, her tone genuine. "It's good to see you like this." "I am happy," I said, smiling. "Happier than I ever thought I could be." She nodded, her eyes drifting to Christopher and the baby. "You deserve it." For the first time in years, I truly believed those words. Years passed, and life unfolded in ways I could have never imagined. Christopher and I built a life filled with love, laughter, and growth. Watching Benjamin Christopher grow was one of the greatest joys of my life. His curiosity, his boundless energy, and his endless questions made every day an adventure. Our son wasn't just a reflection of us, he was his own person, full of potential and light. And though his name carried a weighty history, it was no longer a reminder of pain or regret. It was a testament to how far I'd come, how I'd rewritten my story, and how I'd found peace in the life I'd chosen. One crisp autumn morning, as I prepared breakfast, Christopher walked into the kitchen, holding a dusty box. "Found this in the attic," he said, placing it on the counter. I recognized it immediately, it was the box Benjamin had sent me before he left. The journal. The memories. "I thought you might want to decide what to do with it," Christopher said, his tone gentle. I stared at the box, emotions swirling. It had been years since I'd last thought about its contents. I wasn't sure if I was ready to open it, but something in me whispered that it was time. Christopher placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. Take your time. After he left, I sat at the table, the box in front of me. Slowly, I lifted the lid. The journal was still there, along with the sketches Benjamin had drawn. Flipping through the pages, I saw the life we'd once shared in vivid detail. The arguments, the laughter, the love, all preserved in ink. But as I read, I realized something profound. The person in those pages wasn't me anymore. She was a shadow of who I'd been, a version of myself that no longer existed. And while I could honor her journey, I didn't have to carry her burdens. When I reached the final page of the journal, I found a note scrawled in Benjamin's familiar handwriting. If you're reading this, Isabella, I hope it's because you found peace. I hope you've built the life you deserve, with someone who cherishes you the way I never could. Thank you for everything. For teaching me what love is, even if I didn't understand it at the time. Benjamin, I closed the journal, tears slipping down my cheeks. They weren't tears of sadness, but of gratitude. Benjamin had been a chapter in my life, a significant one, but he wasn't the story. The story was here, in the life I'd built with Christopher and our son. Later that evening, as Christopher and I sat on the porch watching Benjamin Christopher play in the yard, I handed him the journal. You're giving this to me? He asked, surprised. I don't need it anymore, I said. It's part of the past, and I'm ready to let it go. Christopher studied me for a moment, then nodded. I'll take care of it. We sat in silence for a while, the golden light of the setting sun casting a warm glow over the yard. Our son laughed as he chased the falling leaves, his joy infectious. Christopher reached for my hand, his grip firm and steady. You've come a long way, Isabella, he said softly. And I'm proud of you. I smiled, leaning into him. I couldn't have done it without you. No, he said, shaking his head. You did this. You chose this life. You fought for it. He was right. I had chosen this life, and I would choose it again 1,000 times over. As the years continued to pass, I found that the memories of my past life and Benjamin became less vivid. They were like an old photograph, tucked away in an album I no longer needed to open. Instead, my days were filled with new memories. Ones of family trips, milestones, and quiet moments shared with the people I loved most. And though I couldn't say for certain where Benjamin's journey had taken him, I hoped he had found peace in the end. As for me, I had finally found mine. One evening, years later, as I watched my son prepare for his first day of college, I was struck by how much he had grown. He was confident, kind, and full of ambition, a reflection of the life Christopher and I had built together. Mom, he said, turning to me with a grin. You okay? You look like you're about to cry. I'm fine, I said, laughing through the tears. Just proud of you. He hugged me tightly, and in that moment, I realized how far I'd come. Life hadn't been perfect, but it had been mine. Every choice, every mistake, every triumph had led me here, to a life filled with love, growth, and endless possibility. As I stood there, watching my son embark on his own journey, I felt a deep sense of contentment. The past no longer held power over me. The future was bright, and the present was enough. I had finally found my happily ever after.